They say you can bury a name, but not the blood that carried it. Deep in the Appalachian folds of West Virginia, there was once a village that never made it to any official map. Locals whispered its name, not in reverence, but in warning. The name was the same as its people's surname. Every man, woman, and child bore it like a birthmark. It was both their pride and their curse. No one new ever came in, and no one born there ever left. The mountains wrapped around it like ribs around a heart, and for nearly a century that heart beat only for itself. It's said the founding family arrived in the late 1800s, fleeing debt, scandal, or perhaps something darker. The truth is hard to pin down because the village burned its records twice, once by accident, once by intention. Those who did pass through described the place as still, too still. No laughter, no church bells, no dogs barking, only the sound of wind through hollow windows and the slow drag of footsteps that seemed to echo long after they stopped. But what unsettled them most was how everyone looked the same. There were small differences, the set of a jaw, the color of an eye, but the bones, the structure, the subtle shape of every face, it all felt eerily familiar, as if the village itself was folding in on its own bloodline. And yet they seemed proud of it. "We keep to our own," one elder had said to a visiting census man in 1912. That man didn't finish his work. His last report ended mid-sentence, found years later in a government archive. The final line read, "They told me their name was the village's name, and that they were born to keep it alive." What followed, the silence, the sickness, the strange disappearances, would be buried under floods and time. But whispers survived. Travelers spoke of a road that leads to nowhere, and of a family name that keeps calling itself home. If you ever find hat name carved into stone, you might notice something strange about the dates. They overlap. Fathers born the same year as their sons, mothers buried beside their own mothers under the same name. A lineage that refused to die, even when it should have. The story of how it began depends on who you ask, but they all agree on one thing. It started with a promise made in desperation, sealed not with ink, but with blood. The founder, a man named Elijah, came to those mountains in 1879 with 2 wagons, 4 children, and a wife whose face no one remembered clearly. Some say she died on the road, others whisper she never existed at all. What is known is that Elijah carved the first house from the bones of the forest, white oak and chestnut, and named it after himself, not as a boast, but as a declaration. He was a man convinced that names had power, that blood could trap a curse or preserve a blessing depending on how you used it. He told his children that if they married outside the name, the family's spirit would scatter. If they married within it, it would grow stronger, like a vine reclaiming what was once its own. At first it was just cousins, 2 branches on the same tree bending toward each other. Then the tree began to twist. Brothers took nieces, uncles took their brothers' daughters, and when the children came, no one questioned it, because every child was born of the same name, and the name was all that mattered. By the turn of the century, the village was a closed loop. Outsiders who passed through found it hard to stay, not because they were unwelcome, though they were, but because something about the air pressed down on them. One traveler described it as breathing through someone else's lungs. The old people said Elijah's words had become prophecy, that his bloodline had indeed grown stronger, not in body, but in will. The children were pale, slow-speaking, and watchful. They didn't laugh like other children did. They didn't even cry at birth, or so it was told. The village had no church, no school, no graveyard at first. They buried their dead behind their homes, marking each mound with the same name, theirs. When the wind swept across those mounds, it carried whispers that sounded almost human. Almost. What they couldn't know then was that Elijah's promise, to preserve the name, would soon become their undoing. Because when you trap your blood in a circle, it doesn't stay pure. It festers. It remembers what it shouldn't. And it starts to change. By 1923, the village had become a living relic, a place forgotten by maps and ignored by time. The last train line that once brushed the edge of its valley was dismantled for scrap during the war, and with it, any easy path in or out disappeared. The outside world was moving forward, cities glowing with electricity, factories breathing smoke into the night. But the village remained frozen, lit only by oil lamps and a fire that never seemed to burn out. Those who lived nearby, miles downriver, began noticing strange things washing up after heavy rains. Old wooden toys, stitched with initials that matched the village's name, jars sealed with wax and filled with what looked like hair, faded photographs where faces blurred into each other, too similar to tell apart. A local preacher once tried to bring salvation to that valley. He'd heard of the inbreeding, of the blasphemous unions, and thought he could save their souls. He only made it halfway there before turning back. He said the trees felt wrong, that they grew too close together, their roots choking one another in silence. He spoke of a presence that seemed to watch him, not from the shadows, but from the land itself. The preacher's final sermon mentioned them. He called the village a place that married its own name, a phrase that caught in the tongue of every man who heard it. Some say he was cursed for speaking it aloud. He never preached again. Meanwhile, within the valley, the bloodline tightened its noose. Generations began to collapse inward, their features merging into a single haunting template: high foreheads, wide-set eyes, narrow mouths that never quite closed. Some had voices so faint you had to lean close to hear them. Others had none at all. There were rumors that by then the people of the village could recognize each other without sight, by breath, by movement, by something older than laws. Guage, they shared dreams, they shared memories, they spoke less and less because there was no need to. When a government official finally came in 1938 to investigate a string of missing persons, he described the encounter as looking into a mirror that didn't quite reflect you right. His report was brief, sealed, and never released to the public. But the final line, that one survived. It read, "The name isn't just what they call themselves, it's what they've become." As the world outside plunged into war, the village sank deeper into itself. By the 1940s, it had become more myth than memory. The road that led there was barely visible, just a scar of gravel swallowed by weeds and silence. Those few who claimed to have found it spoke of a smell they couldn't name, a sweetness rotting in the air, like fruit left too long in the sun. And always there were eyes, watching from behind curtains, from cracks in door frames, from the edge of the trees. But what disturbed the rare visitor most wasn't the faces. It was the sameness. Generations of blood folding back upon itself had created something uncanny, something the human mind couldn't quite accept. The villagers' features seemed half forgotten, half repeated, as though time itself had started copying and pasting them. Still, they lived, in their way. Their rituals had become quiet, intimate, almost holy. Births were celebrated not for life, but for continuance. Deaths were not mourned. They were spoken of as returning. It was said that when one of them died, the body was kept inside the home for 3 days, as if waiting for something to pass, not the soul, but the name itself. By then, they had stopped writing things down. No ledgers, no records, just carvings, small symbols on doors, in the bark of trees, on stones that marked the soil of their ancestors. Each mark looked the same, 2 overlapping letters, the initials of their surname, drawn so many times that the grooves in the wood bled into each other. And yet, something shifted. Around 1948, a child was born who did not speak the name. She refused it, would not answer to it. Her mother, a woman said to have eyes like milk, wept for 3 days straight. The elders called it an omen, the first fracture in a perfect circle. Some say that girl tried to run away, that she followed the creek down the mountain until it spiraled, lit into 3 paths, one of water, one of stone, one of mud. Only one led out, and no one knows which she took. Her disappearance broke something inside the village. For the first time, a name was missing, and in a place where the name was everything, that absence echoed like a scream. From then on, every birth, every death, every whisper carried the weight of her defiance, and the question of what happens when a curse finally tries to set itself free. By the 1960s, what was left of the village existed only in rumor, a hollow echo in the holler. A few families still lived there, still bearing the same name, still whispering the same prayers to their dead. But the blood had turned thin. The children born in those years were not like the ones before. Some were sickly, others never learned to speak. A few were born without sight and yet seemed to move through the woods as if guided by something unseen. The government came again, not for mercy this time, but for data. A quiet investigation led by a small university promised medical aid and documentation. They brought cameras, not compassion, and what they captured, even through the grain of black and white film, was enough to make grown men fall silent. Entire generations bearing one name, one face, one history, looping endlessly. The footage was stored in an archive under a false label. Decades later, a film student stumbled across it by accident. No one knows what she saw first: the faces, the graves, or the house with the initials carved into every wall. But she didn't finish her project. She withdrew from school and disappeared 3 months later. The few locals who remembered the old stories said it was because she had spoken the name aloud. They said that once it's spoken, the name looks for you, that it doesn't like being forgotten. By the late 70s, the government declared the valley uninhabitable after a series of mudslides and sinkholes swallowed what remained of the road. Officially, the village no longer existed, but the records show one anomaly: a census line that refused to close, a single name, typed over and over again, filling the form until the ink ran out. Those who lived nearby claim that sometimes in the fall, when the fog sits heavy in the hollows, they can hear faint chanting, voices rising and falling like breath. Always the same word, always the same name. And if you walk far enough into that valley, where the air grows still and the trees stand too close, you might find a mailbox rusted with age. The letters carved into its side are almost unreadable, but not quite. And if you lean close enough, you can still make them out. The village didn't just marry its own name, it became it. They say some things die quietly, but this name didn't. It lingered. It waited. In the decades that followed, people who bought land near the old site reported strange inheritances, deeds without origin, property lines signed by hands that should have been dead for a century. The name appeared again and again, inked into documents, scratched into door frames, whispered by those who didn't even know why they were saying it. In 1986, a historian from Charleston tried to trace the genealogy of the village for a local heritage project. He thought it would be a curiosity, a small, self-contained story about isolation and old Appalachia. But as he dug deeper, the lines began to twist. Birth records contradicted death certificates. Families appeared to overlap, loop back, merge. He found names repeating for 6, 7 generations, the same birth dates, the same signatures, the same children listed twice. When he presented his findings to the county board, they called it clerical error. He called it something else. His last recorded note, written in a shaking hand, read simply, "The blood remembers itself." His wife found him 2 days later, sitting at his desk with the old village name written across his palms, carved so deep the ink had seeped beneath the skin. By the turn of the millennium, what remained of that place was dust and memory. Nature had taken it back, as if trying to smother what humanity had made there. But the locals say the soil still breathes differently. Soft, like freshly dug graves. They say the trees grow in circles, following a pattern only the dead could trace. And sometimes when storms move through the valley, voices rise with the thunder. They don't sound like mourning. They sound like calling. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have left, or would you have stayed to keep the name alive? Because in the end, the story of that village isn't about madness or sin, it's about devotion. Blind, relentless devotion to something that should have been let go. But they couldn't. They wouldn't. And now the name has no need for flesh or memory. It lives where all forgotten things live, between the roots, beneath the stones, in the dark where no one dares to speak it. And maybe it's better that way. They call it superstition now, an old ghost story from the mountains, but names have weight, and some refuse to rest. In 2014, a group of amateur explorers went looking for what they called the Lost Village. They carried cameras, maps, and bravado, convinced they'd find nothing more than crumbling stone and silence. The footage they uploaded never showed a single structure. Just trees, endless trees, and the faint outline of symbols carved into the bark. About halfway through, one of them starts whispering, not in fear, but recognition. He says he's seen the carvings before, not here, but in his grandfather's barn, hundreds of miles away. When they ask him what the marks mean, he just laughs and says, "It's our name." The camera cuts to static after that. A week later, local authorities found their truck abandoned at the edge of the valley. The keys were still in the ignition, and the radio was humming a low, warbling tone that no one could explain. Their gear was gone. Their names, all four of them, appeared on a census list for a county they'd never visited, the same county that once held the village. Maybe that's how the story survives now, not through blood or faith or will, but through the quiet spread of something that wants to be remembered, something that calls out through the names we inherit, the signatures we don't question, the places that still echo beneath our feet. When I first found the old files, brittle photos, censored reports, the sealed reels of film, I thought it was just another forgotten tragedy. But the deeper I looked, the more I felt it staring back, like the story wanted me to tell it, like the name had been waiting. If you ever find yourself driving through the hollows of West Virginia and you see an unmarked road that isn't on your map, don't follow it, because if you do, you might start to feel it too. The air thickening, the sound of your own name echoing just a little too late. And if you hear a voice in the dark whispering the village's name, don't answer, because once you do, it remembers you, and it never forgets its own.